Today we'll be discussing a very interesting and relevant shaila for those that have pets, and that is the prohibition of eating before an animal. Before we begin, as always, Rav should be consulted, and this should not be relied upon for halachic psak. We all know that there's a halacha that you're not supposed to eat before you feed your animals, right? That's the Medrash says that Noach in the Teva was bitten by the lion because he ate before the lion. So there's such a halacha. So I want to discuss some of the more common effects of this halacha. The Gemara in Brachis Daf Mem discusses what you're allowed to after you make the bracha of hamotzi. When it comes to what you're allowed to say, so meaning in between eating the bread and making hamotzi, you're not supposed to say anything. The question is, what are you allowed to say technically, and it won't require you to repeat the bracha. So the Gemara says, Rav Sheshes Amar, Rav Sheshes says, Afilu gavel l'turi nami einay tzarech levarech, Dam Rav Yehuda Merav, Asal Adam sheyechel koydem sheyitin machal behema. Shenemar v'nasati esa besadcha levemtecha v'hader v'achalta v'savata. Says the Gemara, if you said the bracha of hamotzi, and before you ate the bread, you then thought to yourself, oh, I haven't fed my animal, you're allowed to quickly tell someone, go feed an animal, even though you haven't eaten your bread yet. Why? Because it's absolutely a very important requirement for you to stop what you're doing and feed your animal right away before you eat, because that's the halacha. It's forbidden for a person to eat before he feeds his animal, and the source for this is the pasuk. It says, we say it in Kriya Shema, v'nasati esav b'sadcha livemtecha, and then v'achalta v'savata. It says that Hashem says that I'm describing giving food for your animals, and then the pasuk says you're going to eat. So therefore, it seems that you have to feed your animal first. So the Maram in Rotenberg in Chelik Dalet Siman Shin Beis writes that he says the reason why you're allowed to tell someone to feed your animal in between the bracha of hamotzi and eating is the hasam ika iser de oraisa, because it is biblically prohibited to eat before you feed your animal, and therefore, because we're dealing with a biblical prohibition, you're allowed to stop what you're doing, even though it's in between the bracha of hamotzi and eating. You're allowed to stop what you're doing to avoid a biblical prohibition. The Maram in Rotenberg feels that based on the pasuk of Nesati Esa Besadcha and Achalta V'Savata, that there is a Isser de Oraisa, there is a biblical prohibition from eating before you feed your animal. The Stei Chemed in Chelik Aleph Siman Kuf, however, cites from the Sefer Shvus Yaakov, who was one of the Achronim, that it's only a rabbinic prohibition. So it seems to be that it's a machlokas. Maybe he didn't see the Maram Rotenberg, because usually Achronim don't argue on Rishonim, but the Maram Rotenberg feels that it's a biblical prohibition. The Shvus Yaakov seems that he says that it's only a rabbinic prohibition. So it seems to be a machlokas between the authorities, whether it's doraisa, whether it's a biblical prohibition or a rabbinic prohibition. The Rambam in Hilchos Avodim is describing how a Jewish owner is supposed to treat his Eved Knani, his non-Jewish slave. And he says, Mutal avay be'eved Knani befarach. Technically, you can treat your non-Jewish slave harshly. And even though that's true, however, Midas Chasidus, V'darkei Chachma, Midas Chasidus tells us Shia Adam Rachaman, that you should have mercy, V'roidev Tzedek, V'yachbet Oilei al Abda, you shouldn't give him tremendous amount of work, V'yetzer Loi, V'yachileo, V'yashkei V'chol Machal Mechomishte, you should give him all the food and all the drink that he needs. And he says the following line, which I think is pretty relevant for our discussion. Chachamim harishainim, the original Chachamim hayunosnim le'eved mekol tavshel v'tashish hayu ochlin. The original Chachamim, when they would feed themselves, they would prepare their own food. They would prepare a double serving, one for them and one for their servants. Umagdimin mazen habehemas v'havadim l'sudas atzman. And the original Chachamim would make sure to feed their animals before they ate themselves. That's what the Rambam says. Now, it appears that this is not a biblical prohibition, or even a rabbinic prohibition, because how could you say that the original wise men would feed their animals first? It seems that feeding your animal first is not a biblical prohibition. If it was a biblical prohibition, you wouldn't say the wise people do, you say everybody has to do it. And if it was a rabbinic prohibition, the same as well, that you would say everybody has to do it. What does it mean that the original wise men, it sounds that this is something that it's called midas chasidus. It's not a requirement, it's not something you have to do, but it's considered a nice thing. So it seems, I don't know what he does with that Gemara. Maybe he feels that you're allowed to interrupt hamotzi and eating for this. Maybe he feels that this is part of the Suda, but because it's a midas chasidus, you're allowed to stop what you're doing and feed your animal. But again, so to summarize, we basically have three opinions whether you're allowed to define the prohibition of eating before your animal, eating your own meal before feeding your animal. So the Maram Rutenberg says that it's Doraisa, the Shus Yaakov says that it's rabbinic, and the Rambam seems to indicate that it's only a midas chasidus. The Chida in Birkei Yosef in Kuchsav Samach Zayin Sukkot and Vav writes the following from the Sefer Chasidim: Le'inyan sameh, someone who is thirsty, Adam kaidem l'mehema. When it comes to drinking, someone who's thirsty, the person comes before feeding the animal. Meaning, although when you're sitting down for your meal, you have to feed the animal first, but if you're thirsty and you're drinking, and you have to feed yourself and you have to feed your animal, you come first when it comes to drinking. It should be noted that when Rivka Imenu actually, when she fed Eliezer and then the camels, so it seems to back up this halacha. She fed the animals first. She fed Eliezer first before the animals. So they asked Rav Tzipei Safrank in Har Tzvi Siman Tzadi that this halacha, that if someone is thirsty, he gets to drink before his animal. What's the reason for it? So Rav Tzipei Safrank says the following: Ani amarti b'zeh time. I feel that there are two reasons. The first one is the Eish Leimer, the Tsar Shel Tzameh Kasha Yoser V'lachem B'Tzameh Einem Mechuyev L'Haktib L'Behema. Says Rav Tzipei Safrank, the first reason is that, it's one thing when you're a little hungry. Okay, so you're a little hungry. It's not the end of the world. So you feed your animal first. It takes you a couple minutes. You feed your animal, then you feed yourself. That's not the big deal. But when someone's thirsty, the pain of thirst is very, very strong, and therefore that pain you don't have to go through, and you're allowed to drink first. That's what he says. So when you're hungry, even though you're hungry and your animal's hungry, you have to feed your animal first, because you can wait a couple minutes. The pain of hunger is not so strong, but the pain of thirst is extremely, extremely strong. That's what he says. And he says, I add a second reason why you're allowed to drink before your animal. He says a very interesting thing, and that is the reason why you're not allowed to eat before your animal. According to Rav Tzipei Safrank, the understanding is, the lumdus behind it is, the reasoning behind it is, we're concerned that you're going to start your meal, and then you're going to have a long meal, and a couple hours later you realize, I didn't feed my animal. The animal went a couple hours without eating. That's the whole reason why you're not allowed to eat before your animal. So says Rav Tzipei Safrank, that obviously won't apply to drinking. There's no concern by drinking that you might come to drink a cup of water and then that cup of water is going to lead to 3 hours of drinking water. Obviously that's not a concern. So therefore, says Rav Tzipei Safrank, the whole issue of eating before your animal is only by eating, because it might lead to a long suda and you might come to forget to feed him at all. But by drinking before your animal, there was never a concern. So it appears to me that the difference between the first reason and the second reason is, the first reason is that the pain of thirst, meaning I don't know if you're not thirsty but you just happen to have a cup of water, whether you're allowed to drink before your animal, because you're not thirsty. So the first reason of pain of thirst doesn't really apply, but the second reason does. I'm not 100% sure, but it seems from the poskim that for drinking they weren't as concerned, especially with according to the second reason of Tzipei Safrank, drinking before your animal does not seem to be the biggest concern. Rav Menashe Klein in Chelik Dalet Siman Chavav in Shuvas Mishnah Halachas writes that if you're not the one feeding your animal, meaning the only one who can't eat before the feeding animal is the owner of the animal, because it's his responsibility to feed the animal. But even if the owner of the animal, let's say, has a live-in maid, and her job is to feed the animal every day, then he could eat, because he's not practically the one feeding it. So because he's practically not the one feeding it, as long as he makes sure that there is someone feeding the animal, he can begin eating before feeding the animal. And just to end off, Ramesha Feinstein in Arachaim Chelik Beis Siman Nun Beis writes that if you have a young child who's not able to feed himself, then you should feed your child before you feed the animal. However, once the child is able to make his own meal, then you should tell your child, if possible, then listen, here, make your own food, and I'm going to feed the animal. Meaning, the only person who's responsible who has the problem of eating first, the only person who's really involved with the prohibition of eating before the animal is the owner of the animal, the parent. The child doesn't have to feed the animal, it's not his responsibility. So therefore, if the child is hungry, so you have a child in front of you, you have an animal in front of you, the child comes first. But if the child is already old enough to make his own sandwich, then if then you could accomplish both, kill two birds with one stone. Then you have the child make his own sandwich, you feed the animal, and then Shalom Al Yisrael. But a young child, you don't, you feed the child before you feed the animal. All questions could be sent to avizakatinsky@gmail.com, avizakutinsky@gmail.com.